Thank you for joining us on the Winning at Selling podcast. I'm Bill Hellkamp of Reach Development Systems, and with me is Professor Scott Plum of the Minnesota Sales Institute.
A career as a sales professional is peppered with constant decisions in behavior and responses. Answers can contradict themselves on the same topic, making the source questionable. Today, we have the authority of the sales process, sales management, and contributors to achieving sales goals. Be prepared for a sales transformation as Bill and I discuss sales management that works with author, Harvard professor, and sales management expert Frank Cespedes. That and much more on episode 455 of Winning at Selling podcast.
Well, we'll start off with our book club before we get to Frank. We're very excited to have Frank Cespedes on the show today, but we are going to do chapter 12 of Psycho-Cybernetics, Do-It-Yourself Tranquilizer. I found most interesting in this chapter, Scott, is talking about that you have the choice to respond to the stimuli around you. And
So
we need to make better choices on what we respond to and what we make a decision to react to. So what were your thoughts on that?
I agree. I think if we're ever going to regret any action that we ever performed, it was probably a reaction versus a response. A response is usually intellectual. A reaction is generally emotional. And we've all heard many times that people buy emotionally, they justify it intellectually. But when we're working on communicating, we need to contribute both of them sometimes in our emails and some of our communications.
Right. One of the things that I found most interesting is he used the example of a telephone, right? We can answer a telephone ringing or not. And the funny thing was, I thought he wrote this before even answering machines were around. So it was even more a result of, I've got to answer that. If I don't, I may not hear from them again, right? The fear of missing out. And now we have these smartphones that we were responding to or reacting to the calls, the messages, the emails, the Twitter links. Those things are beeping and booping and dinking and binging all day long. And people are addicted to having to grab that phone the moment it makes a noise and look at it.
It's Pavlov's dog all over again.
Right. And he uses that as an example as well.
I think sometimes our prospects have read this book because they don't answer their own phone. Now I get it. You read Psycho-Cybernetics.
They're in their happy place. So.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they are.
And that's what he talked about too, is that we don't have to be a reactor, but we should focus on relaxing better, finding a time, finding a place, maybe sometime during the day, maybe it's a room we can go to, or just a room in our own mind where we can spend some time relaxing and get away from all those noise and those calls to respond.
Yeah, and create that quiet corner in our imagination. The little mental room, furnish it the way we want with whatever we want, makes us restful and refreshing.
Doilies. I have doilies in my room.
Oh, cute.
Everywhere.
That's cute.
On the armrests. And it's grandma's house. So
one thing that he put in great perspective, I never really thought about it before, is that pictures are the most impressive to our automatic mechanism than words. So that they have a greater impact, particularly so if the picture happens to have a strong symbiotic meaning to it. And that's where I can really see where artwork can be very important. There's a history generally when we have something hanging on our wall, an experience that we had. There's something that we can relate to when we see something. And I think we need to create images in our work environment and our home environment that also create that tranquility and that relaxation that takes us away from the stress of normal everyday life.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to turn off the stuff, turn off the TV, turn off the computer, turn off the phone, get yourself a break from all that input that's coming to us. We just have so much input coming to us from so many sources all the time now that we just tend to react to it all the time. He did a reference to, are you a thermostat or thermometer? I've done a talk before. I don't know where I stole it from, but I'm sure I did, on are you a thermometer or a thermostat? Are you the thermometer that just reflects the actions around you? Or are you a thermostat that controls what's going on, controls the temperature, controls that reaction? And I like that metaphor to think about, I'm going to be the thermostat. I'm going to control my reactions to what's going on.
Yeah, I think about a perfect week for salespeople, and too often I do a session and I hear from salespeople and their thermometers, they tell me what temperature it is. No. Be a thermostat. When something's not coming in, go out and get it. If we're just sitting back and we're just waiting for something to happen, then we're not in sales, we're in customer service. And so
Right.
often I ask salespeople, what's a perfect week? And they say, well, it really depends. I go, depends on what? And who's in charge of your time? And what are you going to do if you're not getting the sales and the interest and the conversations? You need to go out and get them. So don't tell me what happened. Tell me what's going to happen.
Right.
Tell me what you're going to do.
Great summary. Excellent.
So our next book that we're going to be covering is Let's Get Real or Let's Not Play. And this is a book published by Franklin Covey. It's a good book. I mean, I'm really looking forward to going through this book. So there's a link on the show notes. So if you go to the website, winningatselling.com, you'll be able to get a link to that. And we're going to start that probably in about middle of May.
This segment has been brought to you by the Jumpstart Sales Coaching Program, presented by the hosts of the Winning at Selling podcast.
Every professional athlete has a coach, someone to assist and advise. Tiger Woods had 4 swing coaches so that he could stay at the top of his game. What would you like to improve or overcome in the next year? Perhaps as a salesperson, you want to be more productive with your prospecting, overcoming objections, or delivering more effective presentations. As a sales manager, you want to create a spark within your sales team with a new message, a refreshed approach to starting new conversations with prospects, or you are looking for market-ready strategies to increase revenue and shorten the sales cycle with your existing team. Or as a business leader, you want to transform the sales culture and your value proposition for the new marketplace. Whatever your reason, this is the perfect time to engage with an experienced sales coach. That is why your hosts of Winning at Selling podcast, Professor Scott Plum and Bill Hellkamp, have developed the Jumpstart Sales Coaching Program. Now you can receive personal coaching from the same sales professionals you enjoy on this podcast. It all starts with a discussion to give us insights into your specific goals, challenges, needs, and motivation. Go to winningatselling.com to contact Bill or Scott about the Jumpstart Sales Coaching Program. Do you believe you deserve better results? Now is the time to invest in yourself, your people, and your customers, and invest in your future. So our topic today, we're really lucky. We got a special guest, Frank Cespedes, who wrote the book, Sales Management That Works. Frank Cespedes teaches at Harvard Business School. He ran a business, serves on boards, and is affiliated with venture capital and private equity firms. He is the author and co-author of 6 books, as well as articles in the Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, and many more. He has also written more than 50 case studies about companies and numerous technical notes on various business topics, including strategy development and implementation, sales and marketing, leadership, pricing, and startup issues. His most recent book, Sales Management That Works, that we will talk about today, plus market relevant challenges for managers and sales reps. So Frank, thanks for being with us today.
Bill, Scott, my thanks to you. It really is a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, this is very exciting for us. We've had a chance to read the book, maybe not all of it, but I really like what I'm reading.
I've enjoyed your articles in the Harvard Business Review. I've subscribed to that for many years, Frank, and I just love the market relevance and the perspective that you bring every article that you write. So thanks for contributing to the Harvard Business Review.
Folks, flattery will get you anywhere with me.
That's how I got familiar with Frank, and then as I started listening to other podcasts that he's had, I mean, he is really I think the true authority. And as I work alone in the industry, it's always tough to know where am I in the scale, and I've got a little bit of work to do to catch up with Frank. So. Bill and I have prepared a few questions for you, but we also want to hear more about the book maybe after our questions. And my first question is something that is related to the reputation that I have with our listeners. And it's a saying that I have is to stop helping people. So often salespeople describe themselves as helping somebody. And I always say when you help somebody, you're taking control. The prospects that we have, that we work with, fear losing control. We also are assumptive when we help somebody. And I think we take away the ability for them to contribute and for us to be equal in solving a problem. I think when we work with somebody, we have a common goal and a common commitment to reach that goal. And I'm kind of curious, Frank, on your perspective of that. When I say stop helping people, Am I being kind of condescending, or am I being supportive of the sales cycle? I'm just curious of your thoughts. And I'm okay. I'm not offended if you disagree with me. I want to bring this to the listeners and see, am I right or am I wrong?
Well, I don't think you're being condescending, but I think a big part of it, Scott, depends on what we mean by help. And I don't want to sound like a parody of the, the Harvard professor on the one hand, this on the other hand.
Right.
But if by helping we mean going in and challenging the customer, I agree with you. I always think about the executive who says, look, when people call on me, their job is not to ask me what keeps me up at night, but tell me, in some sense, what it is that should keep me up.
Right. Right at a challenger sale. I mean, that's it.
Yeah. The other thing I would say, though, and this is where I think the help may be justifiable. I think in the book we're going to talk about, you'll see some data and research that clearly supports this point of view. We're living in an information data revolution. Both buyers and sellers are inundated with this. The author you quoted, you and Bill quoted at the start about, look, you have a choice to respond to the stimuli. That's very, very good and important advice. But increasingly, one role of the salesperson, especially in complex B2B buying and selling situations, is to help curate that information, the products, the solutions, etc. My point of view is I don't care whether we call that help or asparagus, but it is part of the value added of people that are selling in the third decade of the 21st century.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Frank, thank you for a great book. I've got to admit that I'm not a follower of the Harvard Business Review, and after having sent 3 boys through college, I'm very disappointed in the college experience. So when I got the book, I thought, oh, this is going to be a lofty tome full of, as you said, contradictions on both sides and talking down to me as just a common sales guy. And I got to tell you, I was just pleasantly surprised, not just at the great information that you put forward in it, but at the tone that you speak to the reader at, which is very professional and very much a counselor to help us develop this. And I just love your pragmatism. I don't always find that from a college level person. And it shows that you've been in the business before and you've taken personal responsibility for salespeople. One of the things that impressed me the most was your philosophy as hiring for the task and not for the title. And especially when you talked about, let's quit throwing requirements into a salesperson's bag, such as having to have a bachelor's degree, which don't really necessarily say whether this person will be successful or not. So can we talk more about this whole idea of hiring for the task, not for the title?
Very important issue. And I think the first thing to recognize, Bill, is that there are and always have been inherent challenges in hiring salespeople that just don't exist. Those challenges just don't exist to the same extent in almost any other function. I mean, for example, if you want to hire an engineer, you can go to an engineering school, and it's a little bit like walking into a buffet. Right? What are you interested in? Electrical engineering, chemical engineering? Would you like it with ice cream? Right? They all now minor in environmental engineering.
Right.
If you want to hire someone for the finance or accounting function, you can find people that majored in those topics. The same is true for programming. But of the nearly 5,000 colleges and universities in the United States, the last time I looked, which was about 18 months ago when I started this book, less than 200 even had a sales course, let alone a sales program. So this is a function where the vast majority of people start out knowing almost nothing about what they're going to get paid for.
It seems to be the leftover degree, right? Well, you took a general business degree. Why don't you go look in sales?
Yeah. I think de facto, that is very often the way it works. But on the supply side, many companies make it even worse. They make a tough job harder. They default to the degree. They simply say, well, if somebody spent, let's say, 4 years in college, that this must say something about their personality. This must say something about their knowledge. And that, of course, is very much a random walk, as they say on Wall Street. There's no evidence for that. The other thing, and this is a big part of the motivation I had in writing the book, it's also important to recognize, and I know that when I say this, Bill, Scott, you guys are going to virtually nod your heads, but it's astounding to me throughout my career how often smart, educated people forget this. Of all the functions in business, sales is by far the most context specific. Selling software is different than selling durables, is different than selling professional services. It also differs depending upon where and to whom you're selling. Selling in North America is different than in South America, Asia, etc. Yet sales is that area where for some reason people in and outside of business feel most comfortable making these huge generalizations that are usually unsupported by any empirical data beyond n=1. When I worked for Oracle, when we invested in PayPal, that kind of thing.
Right.
That's my point about hiring for the task. The sales task differs depending on your product, your sales model, the stage of the market, whether it's an initial buy or a rebuy. And that is one of the core responsibilities of anybody managing go-to-market resources, is to make sure they understand those important tasks as they exist today, not yesterday. That's where you start, in my view and in my experience.
Thanks, Frank. Your book, Sales Management That Works, is obviously written for the sales management leadership team. And it's probably, like I think you've said before, that the sales channel is probably a mystery to CEOs. It's the channel that they know the least amount. It's easy to be able to understand other channels within a company, but the sales channel is the one that challenges them the most. What are some of the biggest mistakes or problems that sales managers make for them to learn how to fix them? And what kind of mistakes are the company leadership looking to avoid when they're managing and leading the entire sales channel and creating that sales culture within a company?
Well, let's start with the challenges and mistakes that sales managers tend to make. Probably the most common one is what some people call cloning bias. And that is, this attitude that sales managers, especially many new sales managers, have that, look, what worked for me when I was selling will work for you, even though the market may have changed, the buying unit may have changed, et cetera, et cetera. The second one is the reality of, I'm going to use a multi-syllable word here, but bear with me.
Sure.
The heterogeneity that characterizes almost every sales force on this particular planet. Right?
Yeah.
Sales is an area where individual performance varies much more than in any other function. The top 10 to 20% of salespeople in most sales forces are not just a little bit better than the average. What the data and research shows us is that they're typically a heck of a lot better, 3, 4, 5 times better. And by the way, what I just said is true in most creative occupations. If you look at programmers, if you look at returns to VC companies, et cetera, if you look at patent filings, you're going to find a very, very similar dispersion. And it's the manager's job to recognize and respond to and manage that heterogeneity, not just what worked for him or her. The third thing I would say, and this is always my advice when people say, "Hey, give me the one thing I can do to get better," pay more attention and take seriously performance reviews. Again, because of that heterogeneity, that very significant dispersion in individual performance reviews are, in my experience, and you can't see me on this podcast, but once upon a time I looked like Jimi Hendrix. Now there's not that much hair up there. It's the most underutilized lever for affecting behavior in organizations, especially by busy sales managers. They tend to do drive-by or quickie reviews, and that's very, very bad for two reasons. One reason is that it perpetuates a culture of underperformance. But the second reason is that much of the most important data in any changing market is only available when you do good performance reviews. So when sales managers don't do that, they're also inhibiting the flow of vital information.
Right.
Those would be my three headlines,
Wow.
Scott, about that excellent question.
So as you look at these performance reviews and we tie those to coaching as a goal, as coaching goals, how do you link this to the critical success beyond just hitting quotas or something, looking at the what I would call a lagging indicator? What should we be doing? What should the sales managers be doing in this coaching and performance review area?
Well, the first thing I would say, Bill, is there's a calendar issue here. Any manager, but especially a busy sales manager, facing de facto bogeys every month or every quarter, has to devote time to this core activity. And again, what the research shows us is that most managers, but especially sales managers, even vastly overestimate the amount of time they actually devote to coaching. So, my advice is make sure the manager goes back, looks at his or her calendar, and is devoting relevant time. Then when you do, I think the most important thing about coaching is about behavior. It's not simply about attitude. It's not about going in and sort of establishing the benchmark for the next week, month, or quarter. It's also not about trying to peer into the salesperson's soul. Very few people are good at that, even though many people think they are good at peering into people's souls. It has to be about actionable behavior. And that gets us back to analyzing the sales tasks. In any heterogeneous sales force, different people are going to be better and worse at some of those key tasks. And coaching needs to focus on those things that particular person needs to get better at, as well ultimately as making some judgment about that person's fit for the role. The other thing I would say is that sales managers in particular typically need training and coaching about this activity. The movement from salesperson to sales manager is always a difficult one. You're going from being an individual contributor most of the time to now getting things done through other people. In the company I ran, I waited almost 5 years before bringing in someone to help train me and others in the firm about doing good performance reviews. And I waited 5 years too long. So, those would be the things I'd mention about that, Bill. You've got to devote time to it.
Right.
It's got to be about behavior. And this is not metaphysics. This is not one of those areas of business that are very arcane. This is a very trainable skill.
So are we trying to move each contributor into that role of being the superstar? You mentioned that there's maybe 20% superstars. Are we looking at their behaviors and saying this is the model? Or are we looking at each person as an individual and saying, let's coach them to maximize what they do well?
It's the latter. I'll say to you what I say to executives when I teach this in executive programs at Harvard. I'll teach cases about, doing performance reviews. And the reality is, I think that we on this call and most sales managers know what to do with their top 20% and bottom 20%. You don't need to go to a school of higher education to figure out what to do with the top and the bottom.
The top means stay the hell out of their way and let them do their job.
And continue to make sure that they're motivated. And the
Right.
bottom, you can use whatever euphemisms you want, but we all know what happens there. Right. It's with that 60% in the middle, where small incremental improvements to their performance in the aggregate usually have the biggest impact on the bottom line. And that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to make everybody a star. That's not going to happen. On the other hand, if you can move up the average salesperson 10% in productivity, in the aggregate, that's usually a huge jump for the organization.
Right.
Frank, I'm curious, what step in the sales process do you think is most important?
Well, I mean, it's going to depend on the sales model, on the buyer segment, again, whether it's an initial buy versus a rebuy. Let me give you an example, because again, there's a case study that I teach my MBAs. It's about sales compensation. Their task in the case is to put together the sales comp plan, what incentives, why, for two different early stage ventures. One of them is a platform business that essentially what they're doing is making available the menus and other things from restaurants in their communities. And when you analyze the business and understand what's important about the tasks, this is a business where at the end of the day, the most important sales tasks are showing up and showing up as often as possible. Because the buyers buy for very different reasons at very different times, depending on their budgeting. So it's a business where lead generation and prospecting are very, very important, because once we get a customer with this platform, our marginal costs of serving that customer are very, very low. So what you want to do is get a lot of beans at the top of that particular coffee grinder. The other is a business, it's called Big Belly, and they sell environmental services. And that's a business where it's very, very different, because when you walk into an account, nobody says, hey, I'm against the environment. I think we should trash Mother Earth. They're all interested. But unlike the first business, it's a very long selling cycle, usually multiple requests for proposals. It's a business, in other words, where false positives can kill you. There, the important sales task is not simply lead generation, quite the opposite. It's lead qualification, knowing much sooner rather than later which ones we pursue and which ones we do not. So I give you that example, Bill, because there's no one answer to the most important step in the sales process, because again, this is a very, very context-specific business area.
So again, going back to your task, looking at those tasks that are the most important for that business, that then becomes the most important step.
Yeah, that's right. Let me phrase it this way. It's blunt, but I think accurate. When you're in business, it's a little bit like in the gangster movies when one gangster turns to the other and says, you chose this life. Managers have to remember that. It is not the responsibility of the market to sort of be nice to and accommodate anybody's sales model. It's the responsibility of the selling company to adapt their model to the market, and the market does not stand still.
Mm-hmm. So my next question was going to be about leading versus lagging indicators, because I think sales managers don't always have a good grasp on what they should be monitoring, especially early in the sales process, that causes everything else to happen. I think sales leadership or even company leadership tends to say, how much have you sold for me today? And I think that's a terrible lagging indicator. Is your answer the same on this? The leading indicators are whatever are most important for that company?
Well, yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, in business, the arrow of time only goes forward, right? Nobody really ever made money in business sort of, just singing about the good old days. When you're running a business, I found this out, it's very different than being a professor. I teach case studies. By definition, case studies are about things that already happened. Like most people, I'm brilliant about the past. That's not business. Business is about today and tomorrow. So you always want leading indicators. That is becoming, I think, more important, but in many organizations, tougher to do, because we are living through a data revolution. Couple of things that I would say about this, however. the most important thing, and the, if I can, pump the book again, there's a whole chapter in the book about this. The most important thing are the analytics that have to do with customer conversion. And the good news here is that there are more tools and more data available for companies to get at those conversion analytics that are, Bill, fundamentally leading indicators, not outcomes. And let me also, if I can, the pandemic, I believe, has actually accelerated this process, because what the pandemic has demonstrated to many companies out of necessity is that, in effect, they were overpaying for certain tasks in their sales customer conversion processes. In particular, in many firms, lead generation, which it turns out you can do with less expensive people or sometimes even algorithms. Demos, you can do a number of demos via Zoom or whatever, and many meetings where, it's not required to be there in person. And I don't think that's going to go away after the pandemic. I think that knowledge will stay. But again, there's more data available for this. Right. I'll also just point out one other thing, and that is, never confuse data with the answer to a management issue. Even the best data and the best analytics in the world will never make up for a sales manager who doesn't know how to do performance reviews, or for a sales model that's simply out of touch with what really is the reality of buying. At the end of the day, managers must manage above and beyond the data that they have available to them.
Do you see that sales managers have maybe been lazy and spending too much time on the analytics and not enough time addressing individual needs with salespeople?
Well, I think I'm going to get back to sounding like the parody. I think the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
The yes part, I think, is that we can now measure so many more things. And sales is sort of ground zero for that, because sales has always had lots of metrics. By the way, there are some good things here. That's why sales, if you think about diversity issues and so forth, that's why sales has always been an area, hey, if she can sell, let her sell. I don't care what you think about that. So that's the good thing about metrics. They do help to support meritocracies very often. But there's no doubt that there's a deluge of these metrics, and that's getting worse because as more and more products have software embedded in them, as more and more inside sales models that are very data intensive proliferate, what the technicians call the last click issue becomes important. And in general, metrics are much kinder to the last click than they are to all those other things in the conversion process that ultimately do make or break a sale. So on the one hand, I think there is that problem. On the other hand, the metric that most salespeople, like most people in business, pay attention to is how they get paid, their compensation and incentives. And here I think, you see something that's been remarkably consistent throughout my career. If you look at incentive systems in sales around the world, you'll find that the majority of them, usually about 70%, when you look at the incentives, they're basically tied to top line volume. End of chapter, end of paragraph, end of sentence. They're not tied to the profitability of the sale, the cost to serve that customer, return on invested capital, simply top line volume. In a plan like that, the message to sales leaders and salespeople is very clear. There is no such thing as a bad customer. So, there's a way they cut through the metrics, and that is, hey, let me make the sale. If it takes a discount, give me the discount. Right. That's what I mean by the yes and no.
Right. I have 1,000 other questions, but I did want to make sure that we talked a little bit about pricing, because obviously the salesperson's lament is we're priced too high. And I think that we don't always really look at the pricing and help the salespeople understand what that value proposition is, why we're priced at a certain area, and how that compares to our competition, so we can go into a sales situation feeling strong in what we have as a pricing model.
I agree with that. And I think the point of view you just articulated is becoming increasingly more important in an information-rich world. And again, this is something that will continue and accelerate throughout our careers. In an information-rich world where buyers, both B2B and B2C, can get product and price comparisons either with a few clicks or in many B2B markets with, Marketo and the other forums that give you the other buyers' experiences, it's very, very dangerous to let others set prices because, they don't necessarily have your best interests at heart. And the reality, I think, is that the opportunities to test price and the opportunities for value-based pricing as opposed to cost-plus pricing are increasing in today's world. But there is a remarkable amount of inertia about this. And by the way, not just in sales. I think what you said about sales is exactly right. I ran a business for 11 years. I've worked literally with hundreds of companies around the world in my career. And it's the very, very rare salesperson who says, I think we're pricing too low. Let's raise that. And, the reason is the compensation.
I could still sell it.
Yeah. But the reason is the compensation plan that I mentioned.
Right.
But it goes beyond that. Marketers are not taking advantage of the tools, the A/B tests, the other things that are now out there in which you can test price above and beyond surveys. One of the things we know for sure in market research is that there's usually a big difference between what people say and their actual marketplace behavior, what economists call revealed preference. The good news is we now have tools that can get at behavior. They click or don't click at a certain price, et cetera. And, increasingly it's an abrogation of responsibility not to be using those tools for pricing.
Right.
Frank, as sales managers are being interviewed, I'm curious, what would be a good answer to the question, why do you want to be a sales manager?
Well, the first thing I think is to get back to something I said earlier, it's an important and difficult transition from individual contributor to manager. So the first thing that I guess I'd look for in any response there is, does the candidate recognize that? Do they ask for or seek out any training or development opportunities that help them in making that transition from the individual contributor to someone who's going to get things done through others? I mean, the single biggest complaint that I have heard about sales leaders throughout my career, when I sit on boards or work with executive teams, the single biggest complaint is that, we made Charlie the head of sales. Charlie was a great salesperson, and he continues to be a great salesperson. Unfortunately, he can't manage his way out of a paper bag. That's the single biggest complaint I've heard. Does the candidate recognize that? And do the people doing the hiring and promotion recognize that? The other thing I would say, however, is do not only rely on questions and interviews. And that's true in hiring as well as promotion. Again, sales is the ultimate performance art in business. It is about behavior. It's not about what people say in an interview. So what you want to do is frame assignments where you can judge that person's behavior, right? You can put them on cross-functional project teams. You can put them in other areas where they actually have to work with others and get things done through others. And they find out not only whether they can do it, but whether they like it. And B, you can figure out whether this person can now manage as well as sell. So that's the way I'd answer that question.
And I think too, to understand that they're going to need some training. Just because they're a good salesperson doesn't mean they're going to be a good sales manager and have the tools they need. They may have the desire to do it, but it's a very different skill set.
I agree. And, I also, though, want to say, I disagree with the opposite advice here. There are many people who, recognizing that this is a very, very different skill set, say, therefore, we shouldn't do what a lot of companies do, and that is take well-performing salespeople and make them managerial candidates. This is an area where credibility is important. It's an area where if you're going to make compensation decisions, hiring and firing decisions, performance reviews, etc., you need credibility. And it's very, very difficult to have that credibility if you haven't sold and sold successfully. But as you say, it is a different skill set.
One of the things I've seen, I'm a big baseball fan, so one of the things I've noticed is that the best coaches seem to be that mid-level player who barely made it to the majors, had to work their butt off to just learn how to get to hitting at 275, lived with their glove, but the naturals don't seem to be good coaches because they don't understand what it takes to get to that next level. What would you say to that? To look maybe at that middle person who worked really hard, developed the skills as best they could, might be a better candidate than that superstar.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, because the what you're calling the middle candidate recognizes that you got to work at it, as opposed to, I don't know, Ted Williams, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Ted Williams, who can sort of say, well, get better. Well,
Right.
Let me write that down. Get better.
Well, Kirby Puckett, he gave advice on hitting. He said, hit the ball, man. It's just really big. Just hit it.
That's right. Yeah.
That was his advice on hitting. It's like, yeah, but it's not really big to me, man. And it's coming really fast.
Yeah. But by the way, we're joking and laughing, but throughout my career, you guys check this against your own experience. It is astounding how many performance reviews are basically versions of the manager saying, sell more and get better.
Yeah, right.
I didn't know that.
Work harder.
Yeah.
But Frank, my last question is, should sales managers hire salespeople from the competitors? Is that good or bad?
Well, I don't think it's a moral issue, Scott. I know you're
Okay.
not framing it that way, but
Thank you.
I have nothing wrong. I see nothing wrong with that. Here are the issues, I think, in hiring from competitors. And, think about the number of companies that who hired the star from, I don't know, whatever you consider your current best practice firm. And somehow when she got to our company, she didn't perform here the way she performed there. Now, that's not because that person suddenly got stupid or lost individual capabilities. It's difficult. Talent in sales especially has limited portability. And by the way, there's a very good book about this written by a colleague of mine. His name's Boris Groisberg. It's a book called Chasing Stars. And Boris documents this in a variety of occupations, but especially sales, because sales depends not only on the smarts and skills of the individual rep with customers, but in most situations, it also depends on the relationships that they establish internally at their own firm. And when they move from company A to company B, they've got to recreate all of that from scratch. And what we know is that's not easy. So
under the auspices of you can't work with your old customers because you signed a non-compete contract.
Yeah,
so. Sometimes
that's exactly right. So I think the issue with hiring from competitors is, what are we hiring? Are we hiring that person to do here what they did there? If that's the case, recognize the portability issues. And the second thing here, I think, and this is really what drives the vast majority of hiring in sales, when you ask sales managers, what's your single biggest hiring criterion? By far, the one that's cited the most is, quote, experience.
Exactly.
And that's a sort of ambiguous criterion for a couple of reasons. But one reason is that experience in sales, again, is very, very context specific. What do we mean by experience? Do we mean their industry knowledge, or do we mean their credibility and relationships with a given customer group, in which case the non-compete is going to be an issue? Or do we simply mean selling experience? For example, in a lot of inside sales organizations, with the software, you're now literally making a call every 2 or 3 minutes. Some people thrive in that area and some people go mad. It's like
right.
the hamster on the wheel. There's also a perceived trade-off between hiring someone who has experience and the amount of time or money I've got to spend on training and development. But I think if you understand what training and development is about, including those internal relationships, that's often a false trade-off. So hiring from a competitor, no problem with that. There is a big dispersion in sales talent. You want talent, but recognize that that's not easy to do because of the portability challenges.
Wow. It's interesting because I find that if I hire for industry experience, I'm hiring for the one thing that I'm most competent to teach within my organization.
Yeah.
And if I hire for behaviors, I'm going to hire for the most difficult thing to change in people. So I would much rather hire for behaviors and teach them about my industry.
I agree with you. I think if the issue is the industry, that's a trainable skill. Behaviors, despite what some people believe, it's hard to get born again. It really is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Well, Frank, unfortunately, we're running out of time. Tell us a little bit more about the book, maybe where people can get it, some links that you might have that we can add to our webpage.
Well, I appreciate that. And, I not only write about sales, but I do want to sell copies of this book. I think everybody listening to this podcast should buy hundreds of copies each. Great present for the kids.
We do too.
Yeah. But you can get the book on Amazon. You can get it on Goodreads, all the sites. You can go direct to the publisher, Harvard Business Review Press. A number of people have ordered, volume orders for conferences, clients. There is a volume discount structure, and they do a very clever thing now. They can co-brand the book. In other words, they can make the cover both the book, Harvard Business Review Press, and your particular organization. And despite the fact, Bill, that you don't read Harvard Business Review, it's not
you remembered that. You weren't supposed to remember that.
It is not a bad brand to be associated with.
Yes, it is.
So all of those places one can get copies of the book. And I welcome feedback, especially from people in your audience. I have learned over the years that's the only way to get better on topics like this.
Perfect. Totally agree. Frank, I'm so grateful that you spent some time with us. I've been a big fan of yours from the articles and now the books that you've published, and have really learned a lot. I listened to other podcasts many times. I'm going to listen to this one more than once because there's just so much content in it.
Thank you, Frank. We really appreciate you being on the show with us.
My thanks to you, sincerely.
This segment of Winning at Selling podcast is brought to you by The Art of Prospecting, your guide to getting in the door by Steve Kloida.
Steve Kloida was known internationally for increasing salespeople's ability to make solid appointments with qualified prospects. You too can learn this essential skill by ordering a copy of his superb book, The Art of Prospecting, your guide to getting in the door. In this book, Steve shares the top strategies and tactics he has developed, implemented, and personally tested with more than 1 million sales and prospecting calls. You can get his book on the website, theprospectingexpert.com. In addition, check out his other great online resources. Instant Sales Coaching, which will guide you through 5 online success modules. A guided prospecting process entitled Call Reluctance Transformer, and the Magnetic Selling Strategies Workbook, a detailed step-by-step guide to increasing your sales. Get any of these valuable resources at theprospectingexpert.com.
Well, our final topic is our golden nugget. My golden nugget is from Thomas Paine. The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph.
Well said. Hopefully it was productive conflict, because
Well,
I think there can be a couple types of conflict. But conflict is good because there's two people in the pursuit of truth, I believe.
well, we once we go through it, we get stronger and more capable of dealing with challenges again. So if we give up, it takes us down a bad path.
Right.
So if we have something hard we have to face, something hard we have to overcome, I think we do increase our capacity as people.
And it becomes worth it too.
That's right.
So go to the website, winningatselling.com. You'll be able to get information about how to connect with Bill and I, how to get Frank's book, learn about our next subject book that we're going to be covering. Bill and I love your comments, love your feedback. Tell us what you want us to cover. Tell us what topics you want to learn more about. Tell us what authors that are really making an impression on your life and that we should have on the show. So we're always grateful for your feedback.
Next week, Chapter 13 of Psychocybernetics by Dr. Maxwell Maltz. Last 3 chapters, I think. We finished at 15. This one is how to turn crisis into a creative opportunity. And our topic is, what is your motivation? Frank talked about motivation being important for salespeople. So let's talk about what is your motivation as a salesperson. Go out and get better one skill at a time.
Joyful selling.